the Woods, enriching your maple business. I'm Evelyn Hartman. I'm the Education and Impact Associate with the Appalachia program at Future Generations University. And one of the Appalachia program projects that I'm able to work on is the Reading the Woods professional development tool and training for technical service providers to assist woodland stewards in West Virginia in sustainable forest management and in identifying nature-based enterprises or revenue streams for an existing forest. And so that's everything from medicinals, forest edibles, ecosystem services, and agritourism, greenery or floral products, and timber products, of course. So I'm very excited to introduce our presenter this evening, Robin Suggs. Robin Suggs is the procurement coordinator on the agroforestry team at Appalachian Sustainable Development in Duffield, Virginia. Robin was raised by avid gardeners in the Piedmont region of North Carolina. So horticulture is in his blood, if you will. He went on to receive a degree in flower and nursery crops technology from the North Carolina State University Agricultural Institute. Later, after moving away from the Piedmont to the Great Smoky Mountains of North Carolina, he gained an appreciation and a great respect for the forest. So his career path shifted away from ornamental horticulture to the production of non-timber forest products, specifically forest botanicals. So prior to joining Appalachian Sustainable Development, Robin owned and operated Moon Branch Botanicals. Moon Branch Botanicals is a supplier of quality botanical products out of Graham County, North Carolina. Robin now applies those experiences as a producer and a business owner to his work at Appalachian Sustainable Development and Appalachian Harvest Herb Hub, working with beginning and seasoned producers of medicinal plant species. So thanks so much for being here. We'll have a bit of time at the end for Q&A. So throughout the presentation, don't hesitate to pop in questions, comments. We've already seen some activity in the chat box. That's so great. There's also the Q&A option at the bottom. So Robin, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Evelyn. I appreciate that. You make me sound much more important than I feel tonight, but thank you for that very kind introduction. Welcome, everyone. Again, my name is Robin Suggs, and I'm not sure if y'all are seeing this little bar on my shared screen up there. I'm not sure why that keeps popping up there. Evelyn, can you see the
It looks good on our end.
Yeah, Robin, that's just your Zoom control bar. We can't see that. That's good. Just in case you need to mute and unmute yourself.
That was the source of my concern and my question. So thank you. Hopefully I will be able to shed more light on the botanical world than the technology world tonight. Technology, I'm much better in the woods than I am with PCs. So probably that's a good thing for our purposes tonight. But again, my name is Robin Suggs. I'm with an organization based in Southwest Virginia called Appalachian Sustainable Development. I'm the ASD Agroforestry Herb Hub Procurement Coordinator, and my primary job is procuring and developing a sustainable supply chain for forest and field-grown botanicals in the southern central Appalachians. For those of you all who haven't heard of the Appalachian Harvest Food Hub, Appalachian Sustainable Development envisions a thriving and sustainable herbal economy in Central Appalachia. And y'all forgive me if I can maybe move this. Let me minimize that. That's much better. As you can tell, I will have to read some of this. I may have to shift back and forth from my glasses. I'm of the age now to where I can't see up close with my glasses and I can't see far away without them. So anyway, but basically we work with herbal economies in Central Appalachia where plant conservation is achieved through cultivation. The Appalachian Harvest Herb Hub in Duffield, Virginia is a shared use facility. I'll explain a little bit about this later. That helps medicinal herb farmers sustainably grow, harvest, process, and sell forest botanicals and field-grown herbs to premium markets. So what I'm going to talk about tonight are commonly produced forest botanicals, primarily those that are native in and around the Appalachian region and maybe more broadly the Eastern North American hardwood forest. These will primarily be species that are marketed for their use in the botanical medicines industry. I think we probably have a few edibles in there as well, culinary plants, at least one, if my memory serves correctly. But most all these species are forest-loving species, and our thought here is that perhaps they can segue in and be incorporated into maple sugar growth, sugar bush, and maple syrup production. So without any further ado, I'm going to talk about our first species tonight. Our first candidate is black cohosh. This is a plant, a native forest botanical that most folks have probably, well, I think most folks in the native plant industry and the medicinal plant industry have heard of. I'm not sure if folks in general have heard of it. It's also used ornamentally, but black cohosh ranges naturally from Quebec down through the Midwest, Eastern Midwest, I would say maybe the Mississippi Valley on down to the Gulf Coast, on out to the Atlantic seaboard. It's, you know, and let me explain a little bit about these range maps before I get too far along, because every species that I show will have one of these range maps attached to it. Just because those states and provinces are colored in with the light green does not mean that the plant occurs over that entire state or province. What all that it means is that there's at least one botanical specimen taken from somewhere within that state or province. It may or may not even be widespread within that state or province. You'll also see conspicuously absent in these maps, or in this particular map, is the state of Vermont and New Hampshire, and I believe Nova Scotia, New Brunswick in Canada. I would not hesitate to speculate that black cohosh does indeed occur in Vermont and New Hampshire, and probably New Brunswick and Nova Scotia as well. The fact that they're admitted on this USDA plants database map is more likely an indication that there are no herbarium specimens present from those locales. So take these maps as just sort of a general indicator of where these plants naturally occur. Will they grow outside of these ranges? Probably. Do they have to grow in these ranges? These states that are shaded, or the area that these plants naturally occur? Not necessarily. I think what you'll find is within the states that we look at in these range maps, there's a lot of variation, even say across my home state of North Carolina, from the mountains to the coastal plain. We range from around 6,684 feet at the top of Mount Mitchell to sea level on the coast. And there's all types of habitats in between. In North Carolina and most of the eastern seaboard states, black cohosh would be in the uplands. It's more of a foothills, Piedmont, and mountain species. Within those ranges, it occurs primarily in rich mesic hardwood forest. That means they're rich woods, good deep topsoil that get plenty of rain but are well drained. They're moist, but there's no standing water. It does drain. This particular species prefers deep soils that are high in organic matter, as I just mentioned. This is a relatively high demand species in the herbal products industry, and that's why I figured a lot of folks have probably heard of it. Primarily, it's used for menopausal symptoms. A lot of the herbs we will talk about in tonight's presentation, not all of them, but a lot of them are what we call female herbs. They're herbs that generally, the uses, at least in the medicinal trade, are driven by a lot of female issues. And so this is no exception. You may have seen this marketed as Remifemin in places like Walmart, Walgreens, your local pharmacy. Probably can buy Remifemin on Amazon and various places online. It is a phytopharmaceutical, highly standardized extract that I believe is still made in Europe. Most of our black cohosh is shipped abroad, processed and shipped back to us, which is an unfortunate situation if we're looking at capturing off economic data price points in this particular species market. but there's also a fair amount that is sold, produced and sold here in the US. Black cohosh is also known by the Latin binomial Actaea racemosa. I like to joke around about black cohosh's name a little bit for those of you all who perhaps have never met a Roman and are not fluent in Latin. But Actaea racemosa used to be called Cimicifuga racemosa. It was originally Actaea racemosa. Then they changed the taxonomy community, changed the name to Cimicifuga racemosa. Now back to Actaea racemosa. Indeed, the plant did not change, simply the way that we classify the plant changed. But most folks know this is black cohosh. It also goes by other names such as rattleweed and American bugbane, or black bugbane, and those sort of names. You don't hear those quite as much as black cohosh. It's fairly easily cultivated from divisions. Basically, root divisions is when you take a rhizome and you break it or cut it up into different sections, and you can plant those sections around throughout your woodland. Prefers dappled shade, but will also grow in full sun if the site is rich and moist enough, and especially at higher latitude or higher altitudes, and probably also higher latitudes. Rhizomes are usually harvested in the fall after the tops of the plants die down, and much of the demand of black cohosh is currently met through the practice of wild harvesting. And we're going to mention a little bit about wild harvesting, and you'll hear me contrast the practice of wild harvesting with that of cultivated supply at various times of this presentation tonight. Wild harvesting simply means that the plant is harvested from naturally occurring populations in the wild. Sometimes on federal land through the federal permitting system. If y'all have USDA Forest Service lands in your region, sometimes it's wild harvested on Forest Service lands through permitting. I'm not so sure about how BLM lands work. I know we don't have any BLM lands here in the East, but I know out West they do. I'm not sure how BLM treats the practice of wild harvesting, if they permit that sort of thing or not. And I also know that not all national forests in the East will permit the collection of wild plants, but in states like North Carolina, they certainly do. I don't know that they do in Virginia. I think they do in West Virginia. Kate may pipe in on that later. But like I say, most black cohosh demand is satisfied through wild harvesting, although more and more are being cultivated. And this is certainly a plant that would do well under the dappled shade of maple trees. So it may be a species that you may want to consider cultivating in your sugar bush. So the next species we'll talk about is another one that's fairly well known, Goldenseal. This is one that also has a fairly similar range to black cohosh. Many of these forest botanicals, you'll notice, range throughout the eastern half of the continent. This particular one ranges from Ontario down to the deep south. I would take those deep southern entries with a little bit of a grain of salt. When you look at the states like Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, it would occur in the very northern tips of those states. North Carolina, it's very, very uncommon. Even though we have high mountains, our pHs and soils are a little less to Goldenseal's liking. So it's probably more abundant or most abundant in the Ohio and Tennessee Valley, places where you have higher pH and typically limestone-based soils. It occurs in rich mesic forest and bottomland hardwood forest. As I mentioned, it prefers circumneutral soils that are high in organic matter. Circumneutral simply means around neutral pH. I believe neutral is 7. Usually you'll find it growing in a range of maybe 5.5 to 7. Could go a little higher than 7, but most plants prefer slightly acidic soil, even the ones that like higher pH. Not many plants like what we would consider alkaline conditions, anything over 7. So I would say, somewhere around 6, 6.5 would be ideal. It's in very high demand in the herbal market. It's valued primarily as a bitter and for its antimicrobial properties. By bitter, I mean that if you taste it, it's certainly very bitter. Bitters have been used as digestive tonics for centuries, and Goldenseal certainly is a very good digestive species or species used to stimulate appetite and to tone the digestive system. In Europe, there's a tradition of drinking bitters before meals, or drinking bitters before you might eat a heavy meal. And so Goldenseal, certainly the bitter compounds within it would fill that bill. But there are also compounds in there that are valued for their antimicrobial properties, used in things like infections of the mucosa, respiratory tract. It's also good as an eye wash. Goldenseal is also known as Hydrastis canadensis. That name has not changed to the best of my knowledge over the past few years. And the reason I brought that up with black cohosh, sometimes if you're researching these species, you'll find several botanical names. You need to look. Usually there's a little designation out by the side, SYN, which means synonym. You'll find a couple of other Latin names. But Goldenseal, in terms of its common name, is also known in states like West Virginia and Kentucky and parts of the Central Appalachians as yellowroot. We get a little farther south, and yellowroot is another species called Xanthorrhiza simplissima. They don't look anything alike. They're not at all related. They both do have berberine, which typically berberine containing plants have a bright red tissue when you look inside the stems of the roots. Goldenseal is no exception. That's where it gets its name. Its rhizome, if you broke it in half, would be bright golden yellow. It's easily cultivated from divisions, especially where it's native. It does require some shade. Again, rhizomes are usually harvested in the fall. Most of these herbaceous perennials that we use in the botanical medicines industry are harvested in the fall after the tops die down. We'll talk about some trees and shrubs later that may not be the case with, but herbaceous perennials, meaning that you've got soft green leafy tissue that comes up in the spring and grows through the summer and then dies down, as opposed to woody tissue like you would have with a tree or a shrub. But most of these herbaceous species that die down in the fall, usually you wait until they die down to harvest them. Usually that's when the compounds become more concentrated in the roots below soil level. Let's see, also with this species, much of the demand is currently met through wild harvesting. There's also an increasing amount of Goldenseal being cultivated in the US, although percentage-wise, it is pretty minuscule compared to what's wild harvested. One thing I will say, this particular species, probably more so since COVID has come on the picture, but the price of this and most forest botanicals pretty much has skyrocketed over the past 12 to 18, 24 months. I know in case of Goldenseal, dried Goldenseal, good quality Goldenseal could be had 2 years ago for $60 a pound. And I recently saw some on a retail botanical retail wholesaler site where it was going for about $230 a pound. I would say that's probably more the exception than the rule, but I think our customers, the last I checked, we were getting over $130 a dried pound for forest grown, verified and certified organic material. So it has increased in price quite a bit over the past year, as a lot of these species have. The next one we'll talk about, I'm guessing if anyone has heard of any of these species we'll talk about tonight, it's this one, American ginseng. Again, it is native to the eastern hardwood forest, ranges from Quebec through the Midwest down to almost the Gulf Coast and along the eastern seaboard. Again, it's a plant that prefers upland areas, foothills, mountains, so it's not going to occur in every area of these states. Would not occur along the immediate Gulf Coast or typically along the immediate Atlantic coast. But it is a plant that is fairly widespread through the Midwest, eastern Midwest, Ohio Valley, Tennessee Valley, southern and central Great Lakes, and throughout the Appalachians on up into eastern Canada. It occurs in rich mesic hardwood forests, but will also occur in some, I wouldn't say, it certainly doesn't occur in xeric sites or dry sites, but it certainly can occur along ridge lines in the Appalachians. So I've seen it occur on some fairly well-drained sites. Regardless, it does prefer fairly deep soils that are high in organic matter. And this one is a little unusual in that it's not unusual that it's in high demand, but it's unusual that almost all of the wild ginseng in this country goes to Asian markets in Korea, mainland China, Vietnam, Taiwan, various places in Eastern Asia. There it's used primarily in traditional Chinese medicine, and it's also used as an adaptogen in Western herbalism as well. American ginseng also goes by the Latin binomial Panax quinquefolius, can be cultivated or produced as a wild simulated crop, primarily from seed. Earlier, I mentioned wild harvesting or wild harvesting. Wild simulated production is the intentional planting of something in conditions that mimic the way a plant would occur in the wild. So with ginseng, what that means is you basically find a wooded site where ginseng, that would be suited for the production of ginseng. You basically go in and plant your seeds. Stratified seeds will come up the next spring. Unstratified seeds take 18 months. They need to go through a cold moist period, warm moist period, then a cold moist period before they'll germinate. So stratified seeds will cut some time off of that. What I mean by stratified, they're seeds that have been artificially subjected to a period of cold moist, warm moist, and then cold moist conditions. But you would plant those seeds in a woodlands and basically come back in 12 to 15 years and harvest what you planted if nothing eats them or steals them in the meanwhile. Poaching is a serious problem on ginseng, and no one really can blame folks for the temptation. I think the price that we got our growers for forest grown verified certified organic ginseng this year was $1,150 a dried pound. That particular material went to a North American market. That's very unusual. Usually, like I mentioned, almost all the wild ginseng or wild simulated ginseng goes to an Asian market where it's highly prized and highly valued, as much for gifting as it is for medicine. Many times as a show of honor or appreciation, if maybe you're getting married or you're being accepted into a new family, or you want to give someone something of high value, many times someone will gift them a dry ginseng root in a glass case, small glass case or something that they can put back and look at. And these roots, could be several hundred to several $1,000s a piece. Ginseng does require some shade. Again, the roots are usually harvested in the fall after the tops die down. Most of the wild demand is currently met through wild harvesting. I did mention wild simulated production. Wild simulated production basically commands a similar or the same price as wild harvested plants. Cultivated material is mostly produced in Wisconsin and Canada, and there's a limited demand for the leaves as well. To give you an idea on the differential in price, I mentioned $1,150 a pound for forest grown verified certified organic dry ginseng. Wild ginseng typically would bring about that in a good year. Cultivated ginseng, maybe $40 to $60 a pound. So there's a huge discrepancy, but that's a whole nother presentation that I would have to go into to describe the intricacies of the ginseng market and its marketing and what the buyers are looking for and production protocols and that sort of thing. And there are there's a lot of information online and printed information as well that you can reference, and probably I think I have a few references at the end of this talk that will help you out with that as well. Bloodroot is the next species we're going to talk about. It occurs in rich mesic hardwood forests throughout the eastern U.S. or eastern North America, from looks like Manitoba across to Quebec on down to the Gulf Coast along the eastern seaboard to a large part of the Midwest. Again, it's fairly specialized in the site requirements, not going to grow across that entire area, but it does have a fairly expanded range compared to some species we'll be talking about tonight. Again, it likes deep soils that are high in organic matter, typical woodland soils typically. There's a low to moderate demand in herbal markets. This is one most of these forest botanicals, we see the demand and sometimes the prices can fluctuate wildly from season to season. Demand is usually fairly shallow and volatile. And Bloodroot is a good example of that. A few years ago, because of some certain projects and demand in Germany, because of the development of an animal feed supplement, Bloodroot was in tremendous demand. Because the German company couldn't satisfy their need in large enough quantities from the acquisition of Bloodroot from North America, they started using an alternate species, Macleia, which can be easily grown. So then the bottom sort of fell out of the Bloodroot market, but to some degree that's agriculture. So Bloodroot is often used as an antimicrobial and again, more recently as a growth promoter in animal feed to replace the use of antibiotics as growth promoters. Bloodroot is also called Sanguinaria canadensis. It's grown by division or seed, probably a little easier by division than seed, requires some shade. The rhizomes are usually harvested in the late summer after the tops die down. Notice this time I didn't say the fall because this one dies down a little earlier than most species. And if you wait too long in the fall, unless you've got the beds marked, you won't be able to find it. Most of the demand is currently met through wild harvesting again, and there's very little cultivation at present. Next species we're hearing a little bit more about in the market these days. There seems to be ever increasing demand for Solomon seal, especially fresh Solomon seal, especially to specialty markets. Primarily, it goes on to be made into medicines like tinctures and that sort of thing, and fairly high demand with herbalists and tincture makers right now. It occurs across much of eastern Canada and much of eastern North America, even to some degree into the Rocky Mountain states. Occurs primarily in mesic hardwood forests. Again, it likes deep soils that are high in organic matter. It's rapidly growing in herbal markets right now. The demand is. It's typically used for connective tissue and musculoskeletal issues. That seems to be driving the rapid market growth at the moment. It's become very popular for folks that have issues with connective tissue, ligaments and tendons and that sort of thing, bursitis and inflammation of joints. I'm not an MD, so I don't want to get in trouble. And I'm not prescribing anything to anyone. Basically, just trying to give you an idea of the types of uses that these plants do find favor with. Solomon seal, also called Polygonatum biflorum, is easily cultivated by seed and by division. Prefers some shade, but it tolerates some sun, again, on cooler, moisture sites. A lot of times it reaches its greatest growth potential in areas that have at least part-day sun, as long as it gets plenty of moisture and it's in good soil. Rhizomes are usually harvested in the spring or in the fall. Some customers prefer spring harvested Solomon seal. Some prefer fall harvested Solomon seal. Most of the demand is currently met through wild harvesting, and fresh material is especially desirable. That's a little unique that herbalists do tend to prefer the fresh material when making tinctures. There's, I guess, a growing feeling and maybe a growing body of evidence that shows that many of the compounds that are desirable in Solomon seal are not, or some of the qualities are lost in the drying process. I'll leave it at that. It's probably the easiest way to explain it. So if you can hook up with a demand for fresh Solomon seal, I almost said false Solomon seal, but fresh Solomon seal. False Solomon seal is a completely different plant. But fresh Solomon seal, you'll probably have a long-term customer and a steady demand. The next species we're going to talk about are ramps. This is a little different than the ones we've talked about so far. This is primarily a culinary plant, one that people eat rather than use for medicine. It's an early spring green. It occurs through much of eastern North America, but again, this map is particularly deceptive in this case in places like East Tennessee, Western North Carolina, North Georgia, parts of Virginia. You'll only find it above 2,000 to 3,000 feet in elevation. That drops substantially as you move north into Canada. I know in the Great Lakes states, it occurs around lake level, so it will occur at much lower elevations there. I think it becomes a little more common the farther north you go as well, although I haven't surveyed a lot of population ramps in the north central states or eastern Canada, but that's my understanding. It occurs in rich, moist hardwood forest at higher elevations and higher elevations in the more southerly locales, as I explained. It also tends to prefer deep soils that are high in organic matter, probably a little moister and a little higher in organic matter than the species that we've talked about before. At least that's my experience from my own personal experience in Western North Carolina. It tends to like those really dark, moist, deep, cool sites, north and east slopes that get a little bit of dappled sun during the day, or certainly early in the spring before the canopy closes in on the hardwood forest. So very high demand in culinary markets. It's often sold as wild edible along with morel mushrooms, fiddleheads, and other types of wild edibles. It's becoming very popular in white tablecloth restaurants in some of the major metropolitan areas around the country. I know in the past, I've sold ramps, next day air to various high-end restaurants across the east. Ramps are also known as Allium triccocum. They're usually grown from seed, especially where they're native. They do require some shade. The leaves and bulbs are harvested in early spring. Primarily, I'll use my cursor here. Primarily, folks are looking for this edible portion of stem just below where the leaves come out, but some folks do eat the leaves as well, and some restaurants do serve the leaves. Another delicacy is pickled ramps. People will take these stalks and pickle them. And I have even seen people that have used these leaves in dried form and mixed in biscuit mixes to make biscuits and sell like a ramp biscuit mix. So it's actually pretty good. Much of the demand is currently met through wild harvesting, but there is some limited cultivation of ramps. They are pretty easy to grow, they're just slow. Like most of these species, taking anywhere from 3 to 15 years in the case of ginseng, the upper end 15 years to get a marketable crop. Sometimes ginseng may be a little less than 15 years. So the next species we're going to talk about is wild yam. Again, it's primarily an Eastern North American native. It occurs in mesic hardwood forest, again, soils that are high in organic matter, and it is high demand in herbal markets. Another what we call a female herb, typically used as a phytoestrogen. It does not have true hormones in the traditional sense of the word, but it does have bioactive compounds that apparently have some bioactivity that mimics hormonal activity. So that is a source of its demand. It's used sometimes in products that are being used internally, sometimes in salves and skin creams and that sort of thing that are used externally. The botanical name for wild yam, there are actually two species. The official wild yam that is in the most herbal materia medica text is Dioscorea villosa, but Dioscorea quaterna, which is also found generally in the same range, is used pretty much interchangeably. The herbalists I've spoken with basically have no preference between the two. And oftentimes what you find in the marketplace is a mixture of both. So take that, for what it's worth. But there are two species that are commonly traded as wild yam, both villosa and quaterna. They're both generally grown from seed or rhizome divisions. Rhizome's a little quicker, but it's a pretty easy plant to grow. Can be grown in sun or shade, needs some shade on warmer, drier sites. Rhizomes are usually harvested in the fall after the tops die down. And much of the demand is currently met through wild harvesting, but again, it's very easy to grow. It's a vining plant, so you're probably going to need to provide some level of support, not quite so much as if you're growing hops, but maybe some trellising. Or you could have it growing up, small trees and shrubs. Again, how these species may or may not be incorporated in a sugar bush or maple syrup production depends on the limits of your imagination. So I've seen some pretty inventive and creative production systems yielded by some out-of-the-box thinking. So these are just some ideas we're throwing out there to maybe get you to see some possibilities that exist on the horizon. And speaking of out-of-the-box thinking, we're moving from herbaceous perennials to small trees and shrubs. And you might think, well, why are we going to plant a small tree or shrub in a sugar bush when it could be competition for sugar maples? This particular plant, witch hazel, is a fairly common understory tree in the East, which means it does occur naturally under the natural shade of larger forest species like sugar maple and basswood and red maple, tulip poplar, those eastern hardwood species. It typically occurs in mesic hardwood forests and moist soils, and many times you'll find it along bluffs, river bluffs, and along creek banks, alluvial areas, floodplains, that sort of thing. It prefers deep soils, high in organic matter. And this is another plant that you may have seen in your neighborhood drugstore. Typically, you'll find it as a liquid preparation, usually just called witch hazel or witch hazel extract. It is in high demand in herbal and cosmetic markets. Extracts are commonly available or commonly used topically as an astringent, which means they tend to tone and tighten the skin. But witch hazel also has some uses internally. Hamamelis virginiana is the universally accepted Latin name at the moment. Can be grown from seed, can also be grown from offshoots and root divisions, can be coppiced as a small tree, which means you can continually cut the top back and force it to put out new shoots from the ground. The parts that we use of the witch hazel typically are the leaves and the stem bark. This does prefer some shade, although it'll take quite a bit of sun in some areas if there's plenty of moisture. When we harvest the bark, we're usually harvesting that in the spring. In the leaves, we usually harvest those in the summer, during the growing season, late spring and summer. The bark and the leaves have slightly different uses, but the reason we harvest the bark in the spring is because that's when the cambium has the highest moisture content, and the bark slips from the wood of the tree more easily in the spring. If you wait too long in the season, it's almost impossible to get the bark off the trunk. Much of the demand is currently met through wild harvesting. There is some managed production, mostly in the Northeast U.S. and places like Connecticut, I believe. And it's a great overstory candidate for multi-story cropping systems. As I mentioned, it's a fairly common component in the understory in many areas of the eastern hardwood forest where it does occur naturally. Another tree that we'll talk about that is high demand, perennially in high demand, is slippery elm. And again, this is a species that ranges throughout much of eastern North America. It occurs in mesic hardwood forest and along sheltered woodland edges. It likes deep soils that are high in organic matter with adequate moisture. And never ceases to amaze me that this is a plant that is perennially, it seems to be in undersupply, always in high demand. It's used as a preparation and ingredient in cough and cold medicines. This particular plant, we use the inner bark. The species that we use the inner bark from, when we harvest the inner bark, we kill the stem that the bark is harvested from. So this is another candidate that should be looked at for coppice production, much like the witch hazel, where we take the older trunks, cut them down, strip the bark, and let the younger stems coming up from the crown of the soil level produce new stems and trunks for harvest a few years down the road. Slippery elm can be an understory tree, but it's probably more of a tree of the woodland edges and growing out on its own. I think in terms of like sugar maple production, this is one you would want to maybe manage in an adjoining woodlot or along maybe the edges of your sugar bush. And forgive me if I'm painting a picture of this that may not be entirely accurate. Haven't tried all these production systems. These are suggestions, and I'm infinitely more familiar with forest botanicals than I am with maple syrup production. But looks like the two should go together fairly well. At least some of these species should be able to segue into some maple syrup or some maple sugar bush production, some production areas. Let's see, slippery elm is also called Ulmus rubra. That's the Latin name. It is grown from seed or root offshoots, typically a medium or large tree. I listed here prefer sun or part shade. I think definitely, the more sun it gets, the more robust and rapid the growth rate. This is one that I know I planted some small saplings about 18, 20 years ago. And I've got, trees that are, 10, 12 inches in diameter, ready to harvest. So it grows pretty well. It's one of the trees that you can actually plant and harvest in your lifetime. Much of the demand is currently met through wild harvesting, though there is some planted production and certified organic managed production. I will say Dutch elm disease can be a problem with this one. It doesn't seem to be quite as susceptible to Dutch elm disease as American elm, but I have noticed some problems in some areas. And with this one, again, we generally harvest the inner bark in the spring. This one is a little different than witch hazel and the next species we're going to talk about, in that we just use the inner bark, which means we have to strip the bark from the trunk, and then we have to take the outer rough bark and strip it from the inner bark. Anyway, the market is pretty well, has pretty stringent specifications on what they're looking for there in terms of what percentage of outer bark that you can get by with. I think it's like maybe 5% outer bark showing, but it's, it's a plant, or it's a product that's in good demand every year, and certainly one worth looking at incorporating into your production, I would think. The next species we're going to talk about is black cherry. It's a common timber species, occurs throughout much of eastern North America, central North America. And I guess I didn't realize, at least apparently according to this range map, occurs in the Pacific Northwest as well. I had no idea that black cherry occurred there, but I'm taking this map at face value. But it is a fairly common timber tree in the east. It likes mesic sites. Will occur on some fairly well-drained sites. It likes deep soil. Moderate demand in the herbal markets. Traditionally, it's used as a cough suppressant. And with this species, we use the bark. Black cherry is also called Prunus serotina or serotina. I think it's serotina, although my Latin's a little rusty. Grows moderately fast. It's a large tree when allowed to grow to its full glory. Prefers full sun, but we'll take some shade when it's young. Typically, we use the inner bark or the young smooth bark that's usually harvested in spring. What you see on the left is a tree that is mostly exhibiting what we call young cherry bark. It's fairly smooth and slick. That's probably the highest demand, highest priced product on the market. Once the tree gets older, the outer bark begins to crack. That's generally called old cherry bark. It's still in demand, but it commands lesser price because there's more woody material and less cambium, hence less bioactive compounds are present. Currently, much of the demand is currently met through wild harvesting. It's also a good overstory candidate for multi-story cropping systems. I would think this one probably would compete with maple, so it's probably one you would want to utilize in your adjoining woodlot or in some other type of adjacent production scenario. So those are the commonly used species of forest botanicals we're going to talk about today. And let me take a moment to segue into how we can help folks that are interested in growing some of these species, market their plants and process them and get them ready for marketing. ASD does provide a lot of training, workshops on propagation, processing, certifications, and more to sort of guide you through the process from seed to sale. We provide at times cost share. Many times we have limited funding available for planting stock and certifications that offer premium market access. if you're looking to get forest grown verified, certified, organic certified, many times we have some funding that can help you with that. Sometimes we have funding to help buy rootstock. It's usually on a cost share basis. Sometimes it's a 50-40 cost share. Sometimes it's 60-40, which simply means you put up 50% of the cost of the material in terms of either cash or your labor in planting it, and we can kick in the other 50%. We don't always have that available, so don't come rushing to the door tonight expecting a lot of money. But sometimes we do have that type of cost share available, and every little bit helps. In terms of processing, we have a shared use facility in Duffield, Virginia. We have some commercial washing, drying, and resizing equipment to help reduce costs, so you don't have to buy that equipment yourself. If you're within a 2 or 3 hour drive of Duffield and it makes sense, certainly we should talk. If you're a little further away, perhaps we can work through some of our partners to hook you up with some processing, maybe a shared use facility a little closer to you, or maybe walk you through the steps of doing some of your processing on site. We also do marketing and aggregation services where, a lot of producers are not necessarily geared toward large scale production, and maybe they're just producing, 25, 50, 100 pounds of this, or 10 pounds of that, or 15 pounds of something else. Many times we can satisfy our orders by combining the production of several different farmers and selling those quantities in 100 pounds and up quantities by pooling production and aggregating orders. So that way small producers can reach larger markets. So if you'd like to get involved in what we're doing, have some contact information below, have a phone number. My email address is rsuggs@asdevelop.org. And also, please, as always, check out our website at asdevelop.org/herbhub. And there's some resources here that I would recommend. Probably the first and foremost that I would recommend is this. There's a book that you can buy at your local bookstore, maybe get them to order it for you, or if you prefer, you can order it off Amazon. It's called Growing and Marketing Ginseng, Goldenseal, and Other Woodland Medicinals. It's by Dr. Janine Davis and Scott Persons. It's an excellent place to get started, sort of a one-stop shop for all things, woodland botanical. I'm a little bit concerned that the next resource that was one of my favorite websites may no longer be up and running. It's ntfpinfo.us. It was a great resource that a friend of mine on the West Coast put together, Dr. Eric Jones with the Institute for Culture and Ecology, where they had it were just like thousands of, online sites and resources and white papers and studies and just a real wealth of information. I need to check and see if that's back up and running. But if you try to find it and don't get it, that's why it's still down. But it's I'm kind of bummed out about that. So anyway, that is it for our formal presentation. I am going to come back to the land of the living now on Zoom. And I think I'm going to field some questions.
Yes, thank you, Robin. That was great. I have so many pages of notes and so much valuable information. And we already have some questions coming in for you. So yeah, I'll go ahead and start asking. So Kimmy asks, how do you recommend someone getting involved? Start foraging these products? ?
Let me get a little more information in terms of getting involved, like marketing or learning how to forage or what to forage. If they're still around, if they want to.
Yeah, Kimmy, if you want to elaborate in the chat. We'll wait on that. Next, Kimmy, respond and then we'll ask it again. Charles asks, is there a commercial market for black walnut hulls? There
is. Currently, we don't have a buyer through our herb hub. depending on what state you're in, you might want to call around to your ginseng dealers, to your state ginseng dealers, and see if they know anybody that's buying walnut hulls. Typically, you want to get them, you want to take them off the walnuts when the hulls are still green. If you wait till they turn black, they usually get these maggots in them, and they're just kind of messy, and they've lost a lot of their medicinal value. So a lot of folks wait too long. But if you want to get them green and dry them, there is a market for them. It's you know, they're used in dyes. They're used for various medicinal uses. I won't say they're necessarily a really high value crop, but they're the years that I've sold black walnut hulls, it was worth it, you know. Maybe that answers the question.
That's great. Thank you. So Kimmy responded, I guess just starting to sell these products, grow them or find them. So yeah.
Okay. Well, if you're, depending on where you are, if you're close to Southwest Virginia, I'd be happy for you to give me a call and we can discuss maybe getting you involved in growing some of these, and we can certainly help you market them. If it's something you want to do on your own, I would recommend getting that book, the one that I mentioned in the resource section. The reason being is that most of my cultural recommendations would be so species specific. It would be hard for me to give you a general overview of like how to get started, growing all woodland medicinals. But the first thing you need to do or to have to grow woodland medicinals is a woods. So if you've got woods and you've got good forest soil, and they're not terribly degraded by exotic invasives, if you're not fighting multiflora rose and Orient Asian bittersweet, and let's see, what's the other one? Elaeagnus, Russian olive, kudzu, some of these ones that are very difficult to get rid of. If you've got an area in a woodland that where the soils are good, where there's a good overstory of native hardwoods, particularly things like sugar maple, black walnut even. Black walnut produces euglone, which is toxic to some species, but most of these native botanicals do fine under black walnuts. Butternut, basswood, tulip poplar, red maple, green ash. Of course, ash are going the way of the eastern hemlock. Our forests are changing. But finding a good woodland site that's suitable for production is your first step, and then learning the ins and outs and the particulars of the preferences of each species in terms of culture would be the next step. And trying to figure out maybe, depending on what state you're in and what market you want to serve, what species might be your priority. I know when I started my business 20 years ago, basically I developed it with the idea of, if somebody called me tomorrow and needed some herbs, what can I walk out my back door and gather from my own forest? What was right there? And, starting there and then starting to embellish what I had and work with the forest I have and manage my woodlot and plant and enhance and work toward bettering the habitat with the certain species I had in mind that I wanted to produce. And there were about 30 species that I traded in. Not all of them were suitable for production on my property, so I ended up having to buy from other harvesters and other folks that wanted to grow and produce species, some of these species as well. Things like wild indigo, which is a sun-loving herb and likes really sort of extreme conditions like south and west facing road cuts where not much else grows. That a plant like that just gets out competed in a place where things grow really well, like in the rich woodlands. So I would have to get those elsewhere. But maybe that'll give you some things to start thinking about.
Yes, Brian and Luke have also recommended getting in touch with U Mountain Center. And also Kimmy is located in West Virginia, Northeastern region. So here in West Virginia in Pocahontas County, we have the U Mountain Center. And then there's United Plant Savers and Rural Action. Thank you, Brian, for recommending those. And they also, United Plant Savers, Rural Action, and all three of these organizations have starter sets of woodland medicinals available often. So,
right. And I noticed we had someone from maybe the Rocky Mountain States or the Western Plains that chimed in during the chat earlier. So I'm not sure where everybody is attending from because I can't see anyone on my Zoom feed. So I'm not really sure who to recommend, but those are in the East, in Ohio Valley and West Virginia, the U Mountain Center, Rural Action, United Plant Savers are great resources. There are some good resources out on the West Coast and the Rocky Mountain States as well. Generally, we're talking about other species, things like OSHA and let's see, what's some of the other ones? Oregon grape and some of those that are trading Pacific Northwest, and there are organizations out there that I'm sure could help as well. I just can't think of any right off the top of my head.
And then can you talk a little bit about sort of the permitting and rights on foraging on public lands and state parks and that sort of thing?
I can speak from the perspective of North Carolina, which is where all my experience, and it varies, the reason being it varies from state to state and from land management agency to land management agency. For instance, the rules that apply with the U.S. Forest Service are going to be different than BLM lands, Bureau of Land Management. I will say national parks are off limits. That's Department of Interior, and typically harvesting on those lands you will end up with a fine or in jail, perhaps. So I would stay away from those areas. The U.S. Forest Service is housed in the U.S. Department of Agriculture, so they manage their forests for production. Though not all national forests in every state will allow for the harvesting of forest botanicals. You'll need to talk with your local ranger district. And every national forest has a local ranger district that covers like a multi-county or certain jurisdiction within the national forest, and they can let you know the specifics in terms of permitting and what's allowed. I know in the Nantahala and Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina, there is a list of species that you're allowed to collect. And those species you can buy permit at a certain rate. Sometimes there are other species at a different rate. But those laws or those regulations are very different in Tennessee. And I have been told that in the George Washington and Thomas Jefferson National Forest in Virginia, that no collection is permitted. So it varies wildly from state to state. BLM, I have little or no experience with, although I do know BLM allows for grazing and other land use activities. So I'm not sure, how harvesting flies on BLM land. You would need to talk to your local management office. State parks, I know North Carolina does not allow for any collection. I don't know of any state park system that does, but I certainly don't know the regulations in every state. Private property with written permission from a landowner is always a good bet. Especially if you're trying to build up germplasm, like your own planting stock, and you can't always find it through established nurseries or online in terms of affordable quantities. Like, yeah, you can buy a bloodroot plant for an ornamental planting for $15 in Wayside Gardens to plant out there in your woodland garden, but that's not economically feasible if you're trying to grow that as plant those in any quantity as on a business scale. What you need is, you need to buy bloodroot or Solomon seal by the pound, and you need to divide that up and plant it. Well, sometimes you can dig material from private property with permission, take that and use that for propagation stock, do your divisions and plant it on your property. If you want to satisfy the sustainability concerns with the landowner, you can dig up a root, break it in half, take the one half of the root and plant it back in the hole that you dug it, or break it in half and plant two back in the hole that you dug it. Where you dug one, you'll have two in 2 or 3 years, and then take the other half, put it in your basket. When you get home or wherever you're going to plant, you break it in 4 or 5 pieces and then plant those out. And, strongly rhizomatous perennials like Solomon seal, blue cohosh, black cohosh, to some degree bloodroot, and a few others will respond very well to division and planting. I would also say that sites slated for destruction from road construction or residential construction, dam building activities, pipelines, pipeline building, those are all good candidate areas for collection of germplasm for planting stock. because you may as well go in and rescue those plants and, plant them and use them for planting stock on your own property rather than having them just destroyed and annihilated by a bulldozer. You can wipe out more in the afternoon with a bulldozer than you could ever harvest in a lifetime. So not only that, but the bulldozer wipes out the habitat as well. So, maybe ask around with some of the land clearing outfits around where you live, or if you know home builders or real estate developers, maybe ask if you can go in before development and do some rescue work.
That's great. Yeah, Stephanie is asking, where do we buy starts for of these plants by the hundreds for commercial scale?
That's a good question. Let me see if I can. I have a hard time walking and chewing gum, so I don't know if I can actually find this link and post it to you, or post it here on Zoom in the chat. We have a list of folks that have indicated that they're willing to sell forest botanicals. I tell you what, Evelyn, do we have everyone's email address? And do they have an email address they could ask us like a question after this is over? I'd be happy to send them that link if it would help.
Yes, if that was from Stephanie. Stephanie, you want to send us, the host and panelists, your email, we can get in touch with you and send you that link.
I was about to say, or Stephanie, if you want to just send an email to syrup@future.edu, that's sort of our catch-all email. I just threw that in the chat. Feel free to do that, and we can get that link to you. And that goes for anybody who's interested in the link, syrup@future.edu.
Yeah, I mean, if I was a little more coordinated with this sort of thing, I could like pop over to my other tab and like pull it off and then come back. But if I did that, y'all may never see me again. So.
Awesome. Well, lots going on in the chat. Another question from Charles. Does blue cohosh have value as a harvested botanical?
It does, but it's a very low volume plant in terms of the market. There's been a lot of controversy over its use. It's a known mutagen. There are some bioactives in blue cohosh that are known to be mutagenic. So, some herbalists are okay with using it in preparation, and other ones are not. But there is a market. I'll leave it at that. Sort of like bloodroot mayapple. The practitioner really needs to know what they're doing, and you need to shield yourself from liability. You don't want to poison anyone or contribute to someone's ill health. So I know basically, when I was selling forest botanicals, I made no claims. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, my customers were using these things to wash their car with, but I made no claims as what they're used for, no claims for like this needs to be taken internally, that this is a food or a medicine. What you do with it is your business, because you just need to be careful in the marketplace. That's a consideration I should throw out there for everyone, that you just need to make sure that if you do get involved in the botanical medicines industry, that you're not presenting yourself as a drug maker or a drug seller. You are simply providing a raw agricultural commodity, okay? Unless you're not, and you are a drug maker, and you want to turn these into phytopharmaceuticals, and if that's the case, you've got more money than I do, and I probably can't teach you much.
Great. Okay, it looks like all of those questions. I want to make sure I didn't miss anyone's question in that chat. Great. Awesome. Thanks for all the backup help and assistance. Wonderful. So I have a question. So it seems through your presentation, it seems like a lot of these species have similar growing conditions. Do they grow well together, like in the same bed or in the same woodlot?
That's a good question. In the herbal community, we have something called plant a lot of people call plant guilds, which are natural associations of plants. And a lot, so a lot of these species like black cohosh and bloodroot and ginseng and Solomon seal, you would find the same general habitat. And that may also include things like maidenhair fern, which is Adiantum pedatum, I believe. Mayapple, which is another forest botanical that is a minor forest botanical. But a lot of times, you know, if you don't have black cohosh growing on your property, but you see maidenhair fern and Solomon seal and maybe or have ginseng perhaps, or bloodroot, that's generally a good indicator that you could plant black cohosh pretty successfully, or blue cohosh. Many of these plants do occur together, and they form what's called a plant community, or, as I mentioned, plant guild. And sometimes those guilds or communities vary from region to region, even from one end of the county to the next. So the main thing I would encourage folks to do is become a student of the woods. You know, go out there and look at the natural woodlands in your area, see what's growing, you know, what's growing together. And also understand, you know, this is something that's really opened my eyes as I've started working more in Southwest Virginia and Ohio and West Virginia, is a lot of woods have been heavily impacted by cattle and deer browsing. We don't have that issue in Western North Carolina so much. So the woods there look very different. But, you know, I get up to a lot of woodlands in Western Virginia, and I think, God, these woods, you know, there's got to be all kinds of black cohosh and ginseng and you know, these various woodland botanicals, and you know, there's nothing. And it's simply, you know, 40 years of cattle running through that have destroyed, you know, the structure of the soil and a lot of the herbaceous layers. So, you know, it doesn't mean that those plants won't grow there, but they need to be reintroduced. And deer is another issue. I don't know why, but part of North Carolina that I'm from, we don't have many deer because it's mostly forested. Deer normally like a mix of like open land and forest land. And so I think, you know, because of where I live in the Smokies, it's mostly heavily forested. There's just not as good a habitat there. And the fact there are a lot of poachers that don't let them live long, probably. But, you know, besides that, we don't have a lot of deer, so that's not an issue. We do have problem with voles and other things, though. And I mean, it's not like it's perfect anywhere. You know, you're going to have some problems everywhere you go. But, you know, I guess what I'm getting at is that, you know, what I've seen in the woods in West Virginia, they look different than a lot of the woods in Ohio, and look different than a lot of the woods in Virginia, that look different than a lot of woods in Eastern Tennessee, and so on and so forth. So, you know, based on my observation in North Carolina, I may not be a lot of help to someone in Eastern Ohio or Southern Ohio, but generally, you know, when we talk about these plants, we're talking about species that grow in, you know, in the herbaceous layer of the eastern hardwood forest, and typically we're talking about, you know, tulip poplar, basswood, you know, buckeye, green ash, sugar maple, red maple, those types of species. You know, probably not talking about eastern red cedar and white oak. You know, those are plants that generally grow in droughtier sites than what we're looking at. So just become a student of your woods. And, you know, one thing state parks are really good for are seeing maybe what, you know, undisturbed ecosystems might look like. Not to say that all state parks are undisturbed, but typically they've maybe been in protection for a while and maybe indicative of what, you know, some of the natural ecosystems originally looked like in an area, or at least some time ago.
We had several folks who are interested in foraging or wild harvesting. And you mentioned that with a lot of these products, you're going out and harvesting after the leaves have started to die off. So in order to know where these things are wild harvesters going out in spring and summer to see where these things are growing and then come back in the fall to harvest? Is that how that sort of works?
Yeah, for someone that's a beginner or novice, you would have to pretty much go out in the growing season and mark the areas that you would harvest. I'm self-taught. Of course, you know, I've been playing with plants since I was, you know, a boy. So maybe, maybe I had some propensity toward, picking things up. But I got to where, I could recognize species by looking at the roots only, sometimes more so by looking at the roots and the tops. I'd be out there in the woods digging up, wild yam, and, you would inadvertently dig up a trillium, a rectum, or bloodroot, or black cohosh, and I say, oh, well, there's a bethroot, there's a black cohosh, there's a bloodroot, it's a ginseng. Once you do it a while, you get really good at that. And then I developed what's called forensic botany, which I started to sort of recognize the plants by the dead like stem and leaf litter that they left behind the previous season. But that's not something you're going to learn in a book or from me. You're just going to have to go out in the woods and figure it out. I'm not trying to be, blow anybody off, but it's true. It's stuff that you just kind of have to figure out. But until you figure it out, you're going to have to like mark your areas and take good notes, because you want to know, what those areas are. And whatever you do, don't do what I did and think you're going to buy a new GPS that you don't know how to use and depend on that. That was a disaster. So anyway, maybe they're better now. I don't know. Or maybe I just don't know what I'm doing anymore. But yeah, you got to kind of know the area that you're going to be digging in and know what's there and take good notes during the growing season.
Yes. Sarah gave a friendly reminder that Jack in the Pulpit looks a little bit like ginseng in the fall, if you're not familiar with your woods and the plants.
The seeds look very much like it. And we could probably recount some good stories about that. But fortunately, the leaves don't look anything like it, and the root looks nothing like it. So.
Michael asks, being as Japanese barberry is high in berberine and a huge problem, is there a market for the roots of it?
There must be. There must be. I don't know of one, but barberry is medicinal, and it certainly has berberine. And the barberry family is known for berberine. So yeah. I don't have a market for it, but there's bound to be one. Somebody, it's got to be a source of naturally occurring berberine. But the thing is like, even though, yellow root and golden seal, when I'm calling yellow root, I'm talking about Xanthorrhiza simplissima and golden seal being Hydrastis canadensis. Those two plants are berberine containing species, as well as barberry. But, the rest of the chemistry can be radically different. Just because they share berberine doesn't mean the rest of their chemistry is the same or even similar. And I would say typically it's not the case across the range of those three species. But barberry is a good source of berberine. And if you're looking to make a bitter or to just develop a source of berberine, it would be a good source. I don't know about the safety of using barberry, like what other compounds are there. So that's another consideration, but I would think that, there's got to be a market for barberry. I just don't know what it is.
Is there a market for combining botanicals with maple syrup or for new flavors?
Yeah, I think the sky's the limit. Why not take a ginseng root and put it in a jar, a bottle of maple syrup, and sell like ginseng infused maple syrup for like $150 a pint? I don't know. They do it with moonshine. I've seen people take, a mason jar of moonshine and put a root of ginseng in it, or vodka, legal liquors. I can't say that word or those words. Legal spirits. I've seen people put like ginseng in and various botanicals. Gin is a good example of juniper berry infused spirits. Honey, I've seen people make lavender honey. So why not experiment and, try to develop some new products with botanical infused maple syrup? I think that's a great idea. If that's where they were going with this, I think that's a great idea.
All right, wonderful. Is there any concern or research that suggests there should be a concern about sort of the emphasis on cultivation by rhizome or root division as opposed to seed for the diversity of your plant community?
Mm-hmm. I think seed production is always going to be a better method concerning biodiversity, protection of biodiversity, because sexual reproduction, you're not producing clones. You're producing a species that there's a lot of genetic variability within that species. When you're asexually producing plant material for propagation, you're taking cuttings or root divisions. You're basically creating clones. So one way you can get around the to some degree the issue of maybe degrading or diminished biodiversity is collect planting stock from a fairly large area, from a fairly genetically diverse range of populations, and then bring those into your nursery bed, and then use that as planting stock. But what often happens, and the way cultivars are developed in horticulture is, someone finds the biggest, most robust bloodroot that has the largest root, and they say, "Aha, I'm going to just divide that one." And they divide that one, plant those out. They all make really big, robust bloodroots, and then they take and divide those and plant that. So pretty soon you've got a cultivar or a landrace developed where you're just planting clones of one particular individual. And if that happens long enough, you do start to degrade or diminish the biodiversity of the species in the area. So it is something you need to be aware of. But through wise management, we can work around it. We don't want to end up with another Irish potato famine where we're all growing the exact same clone and something comes along and wipes us out. So
great. Do nurseries take this into account with their own plants? Are they typically starting from seed? Do you happen to know?
I would say that we have different growers with different priorities and ethics, and I would say that the production protocols would be as wide-ranging as their motivations and ethics. I would say in the if you go to a native plant nursery that's growing primarily for restoration, like wetland mitigation or habitat restoration, usually those types of nurseries are a little more sensitive to genetic diversity. If you're looking at the ornamentals trade, they're not at all. They're looking at, this one has the biggest, brightest flower. This one is a pink form of bloodroot with a double flower, and it's the only one, in existence. So, I'm going to patent it, and of course it's a clone, because I'm going to get royalties off of it. So it really depends on the producer. So it's just like buying produce. They say buy local, know your grower. So the same thing would apply. Ask some questions that, the person you're buying material from is the best way to, suss out their intentions and their production methods.
Awesome. Great. Oh, let's see. More questions. All right, well, we can start to wrap up if want to call it. See, make sure I didn't miss anything in this chat. Okay. Just remembered on the topic of biodiversity, are we seeing any disease? I know invasive species is an issue, but is there any disease that we should be on the lookout for, or identification of disease that we should think
There are plenty, especially with ginseng, and that's another peril with cultivated ginseng production is most cultivated ginseng is heavily sprayed and intensively managed simply because disease pressure is too great to grow it any other way. In the wild, where it's spread out in a biodiverse habitat with lots of other species, you typically don't have the disease pressure, but there is some. You know, I think, you know, personally, I wouldn't go and spray my woodland production with anything, even if it's, you know, OMRI approved. It's just not practical. You know, proper cultural protocols, good airflow, you know, proper thinning of understory goes a long way. But any of these woodland botanicals, because they grow in fairly moist woodland environments, you know, if they get a little too moist, there can be some problems. Usually the farther out away from the native range you go, the more problems you're going to have. If you take, you know, provenance is, you know, we talked about biodiversity, provenance is another issue. If you take, you know, collect bloodroot seeds in you know, Vermont, and you grow them out in North Georgia, you may end up with some disease pressures because, you know, there are some disease problems because higher humidities and temperatures in North Georgia. You know, the plants just adapted to cooler, drier conditions. So, you know, good management goes a long way, but there are diseases, too many to go into tonight. But typically in woodland production, they're not that big of a problem.
Yes. But production, your own sort of production can impact that or prevent. There are preventative measures for disease.
Yeah, it's like, you know, growing chickens in a CAFO versus free range chickens. I mean, when they're on top of each other, like in a really intensive production system, they're much more prone to get sick and diseases and all kinds of weird things happen. Or if they're out, you know, they can roam and they're not like, you know, on top of each other. You don't get as much disease transmission and as much disease pressure typically.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, it doesn't look like any more questions are coming in, so we can wrap up for the evening.
I hope this was helpful, y'all.
It was helpful for me, it's definitely. I really enjoyed this. This was great. Getting lots of thanks in the chat. Yes, thank you, Robin. Really appreciate that.
My pleasure.
Oh yes, I was supposed to mention this. At the end of this, you will be getting a feedback poll. Is that what? You'll be asked some questions. So if you don't mind taking a minute just to answer those questions for us, we greatly appreciate it. Yeah, thank you all for joining. And yeah, we hope to see you next time. Yeah, if you've All right, Kate, do you want to announce the next Out of the Woods event for us?
Out of the Woods is coming to you in December with a little bit of a holiday treat. We are doing a maple in beverages panel. So we'll have a distiller who's using some maple in his distillation process. We'll have a former cider maker, and we're hoping to get a brewer on board as well. So it'll be kind of a fun kickoff to the winter season.
Awesome. Sounds fun. All righty. Great. Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening.